and welcome to Working Your Way, the podcast dedicated to unraveling the journey of being authentic in the workplace. I'm your host, Sandhya Sadakar, and this is part 2 of a 2-part series about the Enneagram framework and how to use it in your career and on your team. In this episode, we're going to dive deep into emotional intelligence. We're going to talk about what it is and what it isn't, and why it's incredibly important to cultivate it in our daily lives, in our careers, and on our teams. And we're going to focus on how the Enneagram can be a very effective tool to do this, including a little more information about the 3 centers of intelligence that are talked about in the framework. Then we'll talk about some other specific ways that we can use our insights about our Enneagram types in our career as individuals and as team members and team leaders. I'm going to be bringing in examples of different types along the way. So if you don't know your Enneagram type or you haven't listened to part 1 yet, I would encourage you to go back and listen to that part first. That's episode 20. In that episode, we covered how personality assessments can actually help us be more authentic. We talked about what the Enneagram is and why it's unique and how to approach identifying your type, as well as going through an overview of the 9 types and some watchouts in how we can use assessments more ethically and responsibly and inclusively. So let's get into part 2. In this episode, we're going to go through some ways that we can actually use the Enneagram in our career and on our teams, going beyond finding your type or identifying your type into how we actually apply the type or the information that we can get from it. But first, I do want to reiterate something that I talked about in part 1. It's really important to use this tool as a tool for development and not a tool for evaluation. We are all complex and dynamic individual humans. We are not our personalities and we are not a type. And because of this, we should never be making assumptions about or evaluations of people because of their type. I will never condone using the Enneagram or any other kind of personality tool or behavioral assessment to make people decisions about who to hire or who has potential or who has a better leadership ability. I will tell you that personality does not determine potential. So now that we have that out of the way, let's talk about where you can go next once you've identified your Enneagram type. We aren't going to talk about all the ways that we can use this framework or the insights that come from it. It's a super comprehensive system and it has a lot of different layers and elements, but we'll dive into some of the different parts of the Enneagram system and some of the main ways that I recommend working with it. So let's start with using the Enneagram for emotional intelligence. I mentioned in part 1, the last episode, episode 20, that the Enneagram is a tool for development. It's about how we grow and evolve. And it is particularly useful in developing our emotional intelligence. It's well documented that emotional intelligence is a critical factor in our career success, especially in leadership. And when it comes to working your way, it's one of the main things we talk about on this podcast, even if I'm not always using that term. Developing our emotional intelligence is about knowing ourselves and managing our emotions in a healthy way and being aware of how we impact others. It's about being able to understand others and have empathy for them and being able to handle conflict when it arises and collaborate effectively on teams with other people. And emotional intelligence is more complex than just knowing how you feel or being able to read the room. It's actually based on a 4-part model in how we relate to ourselves and how we relate to others. So if you're listening to this on audio only, I want you to imagine a 2x2 matrix. And in the 2 columns, we have self and we have others. And in the 2 rows, we have awareness and we have action. So first, when we look at awareness, we have self-awareness and awareness of others or social awareness. And then when we look at action, emotional intelligence isn't just about what happens inside your mind or what you're thinking. It's about taking action. And so we have to practice emotional intelligence with ourselves, which is called self-regulation, and with others, which is called relationship management. So let's start with quadrant 1, self and awareness. So, this is all about self awareness through the Enneagram. And the main question that I focus on when applying the Enneagram to self awareness is, how do your core motivations impact how you behave? And how do your behaviors impact other people? We talked a lot about the difference between motivations and behaviors in part one. Understanding the link between the two is one of the best things that you can do to build your self awareness. And when we can do that, we can better understand what our behaviors look like on a good day or on a bad day. Or high side behaviors when we're doing well, when we're open, when we're receptive, when we're at our best, versus our low side behaviors, the behaviors when we're stressed or exhausted or triggered or at our worst. So let's talk about an example of high side and low side behaviors using the type 7. Now, the type 7 is a possibilities oriented, innovative, idea, and fun loving kind of person. And in their high side of their behaviors, they are that innovative and fun person. They're present for other people. But in their low side, they can be scattered, they can be uncommitted, or they can be so fixated on how they can keep themselves happy that they kind of forget about the needs of others. That same core motivation to see possibilities and innovative options in the world and focusing on happiness and excitement can play out in a way that's amazing for the individuals and the people around them, or it can play out in a way that's not so good for the individuals and the people around them. So you can see how that one motivation can tie to these amazing behaviors, and you can see how the same motivation can tie to behaviors that may put us into patterns that are not really the best things for us. So when we move into quadrant 2, this is where others and awareness intersect. This is called social awareness. And I would use that same question when we're applying the Enneagram, but applying it to others. So, how do others' core motivations impact their behavior? And thinking about how are they different or similar to me? Understanding the context of how others operate through the lens of the Enneagram is one of the most amazing things about it. It's so easy to take a misunderstanding and make it personal, but when we can see more objectively, we can see, oh, there are 9 distinct ways that people can bring their talents to the world, and we need all of them. We can bring a lot more compassion to how we see others, and we can start to recognize how our differences are actually a benefit. Oftentimes, we move into the space of accepting people's differences or tolerating them. But when we can actually embrace them and value them, that's when we can get into a space where we can improve our relationships and we can improve our team collaboration. So, this is a space that I often see on teams. We just talked about type 7s and how they're amazing at innovation and ideas and possibilities. Now, type 6, on the other hand, type 6s are security oriented. They are all about planning and preparation and building safety. They're amazing at projecting out into the future and seeing the opposing viewpoint or seeing where these ideas aren't going to work and where there may be pitfalls or risks if we actually implemented the ideas. And on the surface, on paper, these two types together would be amazing. But what tends to happen is that the type 7 sees the type 6 as negative and pessimistic and just always bringing them down. The type 6 sees the type 7 as unpractical or unfocused or adding a whole bunch of work that isn't going to work out in the end. But using the Enneagram as a tool to build that context and understanding of how different people operate, each team member can actually better see how working together can actually build better business plans, taking brilliant, innovative ideas and mitigating the risks around them. And they can stop making this difference in the way that they operate a personal problem or an annoyance between the two of them. So, we talked about self awareness and we talked about social awareness. We're now going to move into the action quadrants of the emotional intelligence model. So, quadrant 3 is where self and action meet, which is called self regulation. Self regulation is action as it relates to ourselves in terms of, do I understand my triggers? Do I know what I need to stay present and connected to myself? And the question I often work with here when we're talking about, I have this insight about my Enneagram type and I want to apply it to self regulation is how do I show up at my best? And how do I do it more consistently, especially if you're in a leadership position? When we're triggered, this really just means something happened and now I'm experiencing some difficult emotions. But instead of allowing these emotions to pass through us, we often attach additional thoughts and feelings to the emotion. We can go down this rabbit hole of all of those things. Sometimes we might act on the emotion, even in times that we really don't need to do anything about it or we shouldn't do anything about it. And with the Enneagram, we can understand the triggers of each type. We can understand the triggers of ourselves and how they tend to react. So each type reacts differently when triggered. We can learn that about ourselves, recognize that, and name that. And then we get to say, okay, what do I need to do in the moment to fix that? Or what do I need to do ongoing throughout my life to avoid that? So think about your car or your home. When something breaks, we have to go fix it. But we also have this ongoing maintenance that we do in order to avoid things breaking down. So hopefully we can avoid most big mechanical disasters with proper maintenance. But in the course of life, things are still going to break. And even when we're trying our best to maintain it, it can happen. Think about this in terms of your own self care or practices around emotional intelligence to help keep yourself regulated. When you're triggered, you can address it with proper self regulation. But we also need to apply self care throughout our lives and figure out what is it that I need to show up at my best? What do I need to do daily? Things like maintaining every day through good nutrition, movement, ways to process our thoughts and feelings through things like journaling or connecting to loved ones. Essentially, this is about taking care of our bodies, our hearts, and our minds. And then when something breaks, you also need to understand how do you fix it. You aren't always going to be perfectly present and calm. And when something in us gets activated, how do we bring ourselves back to that place of presence? And that could be breathing, taking a walk, practicing some positive self talk. So I'm going to share a couple of examples here using the type 2 and the type 3. The type 2 can be triggered by their help going unnoticed or unappreciated or feeling needy in some way because they can have a lot of pride in doing things for others and not needing others to take care of them. So, this could look like feeling really resentful of the things that you're doing for someone because they feel like they don't appreciate it, or fixating on how much you really don't need things from others and continuing to not take care of yourself. Type 3 is often triggered by obstacles in their way of achieving their goals or possible threats to their image. This could look like getting really impatient in a meeting when someone isn't getting to the point fast enough for them, or being really fixated on some feedback that they receive that might make them look bad. When we can identify our triggers, we can look at situations more objectively, and then we can make those repairs that we need to do to bring ourselves back into a more present state. So, in any of these kind of triggered states, the examples with the 2 or the 3, this could look like breathing. It could look like taking a break or taking a pause or positive self talk, reminding yourself that that threat to my image is not a real threat to my safety and it's going to be okay. So, quadrant 4 is where others and action intersect, and this is called relationship management. How can we emotionally, intelligently act in our relationships? This piece is when, working with teams, it's really about how do we leverage our collective best? That's the question that I would ask is we're going to apply the Enneagram to this quadrant of emotional intelligence of relationship management is how do we leverage that collective best as a team? And this really boils down to communication. I truly believe that all the world's problems can be solved with more clarity and more compassion in our communication. And on teams, it's about how we coach and collaborate and resolve conflicts together. It's really about taking all of this insight and awareness that we've built and using it to communicate what you need from others in a way that they can actually receive it. Being an effective communicator is not something you can do in a vacuum. It's a two-way street. And if somebody can't receive what you're trying to communicate, it's not effective, full stop. It doesn't mean that you aren't trying your best, but it's just not working. So, having all of this knowledge about how you operate and how that differs from how others operate, it can help us communicate in a way that builds a bridge to close those gaps. So, before I share some examples of how I use the Enneagram with teams, let's talk for a moment about the Enneagram Centers of Intelligence. We can use these especially for the action part of the emotional intelligence model. It's about how are you actively practicing emotional intelligence, both in self regulation and in how we relate to and communicate with others. Each of the 9 types fits into one of 3 centers of intelligence: the head center, the heart center, and the body center. The head center, which is made up of types 5, 6, and 7, really takes in the world through this kind of typical cerebral or informational intelligence. They interact with the world through thoughts and information. The heart center really takes in the world through this social or relational intelligence. They interact with the world through feelings and connections to other people or connections to society. These are types 2, 3, and 4. And the body center is made up of types 8, 9, and 1. And they really take in the world through this somatic or instinctual intelligence. They interact with the world through actions and instincts. Now, the idea here is to both embrace your natural type of intelligence of your type and notice it, and then finding balance through all 3 centers. So, we all have somatic intelligence, we all have relational intelligence, and we all have kind of this cerebral or informational intelligence. But we often tend to kind of lean on one more than another. So the question here is really, how are you incorporating thoughts, feelings, and actions more equally as you move throughout your day? Which one do you really lean on? Which one do you kind of ignore altogether? So I'm going to give you a couple of examples about the type 8 and the type 9, which both sit in the body center. And these intelligences play out in different ways for each of these types. So in the body center, you have type 8, which is focused on strength and power and taking charge of situations. They notice their gut instincts or their impulses to act, and they often act on them. Type 8s are very in tune with this somatic intelligence, the urge to act, and they sometimes can overuse it, acting on every little impulse, whether it's overdoing things in life or kind of steamrolling people around them to get things done. Whereas type 9s are focused on harmony and everyone getting along and everyone being heard. And they actually aren't as in touch with their somatic intelligence or these kind of urges to act, or at least they don't realize it's there as much as the 8 does. When there's conflict, they may notice it feels kind of chaotic in their bodies, but they'll kind of retreat or withdraw from the conflict to kind of calm that down. The messages that they get from their body about what they want and what they want to do are often really quiet. There's not nearly as much action as the type 8. There's more ignoring that kind of somatic or body intelligence or withdrawing from a situation to quiet those instincts down. When we can tune into all 3 types of intelligence, we can stay out of our own kind of cyclical patterns more. If you're a type that's constantly thinking about doing but not stopping to feel, you may end up down a path that you don't want to be on, possibly being very successful, but being disconnected from what you really want out of life. And if you listen to episode 1, where I shared my own personal story of my career, you know that this is very much how I was. I was not stopping to feel. I really wasn't in touch with the emotional center, with my own emotions. So, even if you don't know your type, you can consider this question: and how are you balancing thinking, feeling, and doing in your work and in your life? Do you really lean into one type of intelligence? And is there one that you kind of ignore? We talked about this a little bit also in Working Your Way, episode 7. Now, let's talk about some ways that we can apply all of this new insight we have about ourselves and about others using the emotional intelligence that we've developed through the Enneagram in our careers and in the workplace. So, the most common place that I start with individuals and teams in using the Enneagram is to one, know what motivates you. And I'm talking about intrinsic motivation, not external things like salary and awards, even though those are really important. But what is it that drives you from the inside out? What is the thing that fuels you when you can connect to it? Two is getting clear on your strengths and your talents. What are the things that you do effortlessly well? What are the things that you bring to the table that no one else can do as well as you? And three, understanding how you work best. So, what type of work style allows you to thrive? What are the conditions that enable you to do your best work? Knowing these things about yourself, being able to get really specific and articulate what you do best and how you do it can be a game changer for us as individuals in our career. Things like being able to articulate why recognition is important to you and how you like to receive it, or sharing how your thought process works on complex projects and being able to communicate clearly what you need in order to bring that amazing talent to the table, like more time or more space or other resources. This can be a game changer because we can advocate for ourselves and what we need. And those things are ultimately going to deliver better outcomes from our companies as well. So then, when you get to learn all of that and share it with your team, we can take the guessing game out of how to work with each other and how to best leverage each team member in a way that aligns with their natural way of being. The most amazing benefit of this is that we get to do the work that we're best at, and we get to use less energy in doing it because we've reduced the friction and the struggle that can happen when we're working on things that we aren't really that good at, or maybe aren't a great fit, or we're trying to do them in a way that drains a lot of our energy. In addition to that emotional intelligence development that is so critical to us operating in all areas of our lives, when I use the Enneagram with teams, we often focus on three main objectives. One is strengthening the team connection, kind of creating more cohesion and building trust on a team, which is critical to working together. Two is establishing a shared language that makes communication more seamless, helps us reduce misunderstandings. And three, finding opportunities to accelerate the team results by looking at the makeup of the team and balancing out what they might have a lot of with what they don't have. One example of this with a recent team that I worked with, they actually had a lot of people with a more compliant social style. And this means that a lot of the people on the team were more oriented toward taking direction or meshing well with the group. Now, the leader wanted them to step up and bring more innovative ideas to the table and be more proactive about driving change to push things forward. So there was this natural gap here between people who are more prone to harmony or taking direction with a leader that really wanted people to push forward and challenge the status quo. Now, this was something that we could solve through implementing some new team rituals or some different structures in the meetings that really created the space that would feel safe for the folks to challenge the status quo and disagree. And despite the leader feeling like they were clear on the tone moving forward and that they wanted their teammates to do that, there were still barriers to people speaking up and going against the grain. And those barriers could be removed with some of those changes that we made to the way the team worked together. Another team I worked with had a lot of action takers and not a lot of detail oriented people or people who were good at mitigating risks. Now, again, we could solve this by being strategic about the way the team worked together and adding a little bit of smart process in to the team rituals, the team meetings, the team structures around these two areas around detail and risk. There's truly so much more that we could talk about, but I'm going to cut myself off here for now. I really, really love this work, and I get really excited about all the ways that I can apply this framework at an individual level to help you work your way and on teams to create a more inclusive environment that allows people to show up authentically and really brings out their best. Okay, so we covered a lot here. We talked through the four quadrants of the emotional intelligence model and how we can use the Enneagram to develop ourselves in each one of these four areas. We talked about the three centers of intelligence and how finding balance between our thoughts, feelings, and actions can help us take better care of ourselves and build better relationships with others. And we talked about some specific ways that we can use the Enneagram and emotional intelligence at work to thrive individually and as a team. In part one, we linked a ton of good websites and PDF downloads, so be sure to go back to that and check those out if you haven't started there. For this episode, I want to dive a little deeper into those 4 quadrants of emotional intelligence, and so I'll link 2 articles for you if you want to learn more. And then I'll also include 2 Enneagram books. One is a very small, really good reference book called The Essential Enneagram. And the other is a book where, in part one, we talked about social identity and how the Enneagram resources that are out there aren't always really representative of all types of lived experiences. So the second book is one called The Enneagram for Black Liberation by Chi Agorum. She provides a perspective of the Enneagram that's really about, instead of trying to fix ourselves in a culture that tells us that we are the problem, it talks about how we can see what's amazing about what we already have and how we can cultivate our own resilience. I especially recommend this book for people of color, but I think it's a really important perspective for everybody to internalize. So if you're interested in using the Enneagram with your team, I would love to connect with you. Please reach out on any platform, LinkedIn, Instagram, or through my website, selfatwork.com. And I'm sure there will be future Enneagram episodes, so please also send me your Enneagram questions. I would love to hear them.